Hi chickens, welcome to another episode of Deep Chats. This time I'm talking to someone who probably for most of you needs no introduction at all, because like me, she's very old school, if she won't mind me saying, a little bit of a witchy fossil here on YouTube. That's how I like to describe myself, so you're coming with me to Fossil Town. Joey Morris, we know you and love you for being a daughter of the Morrigan and talking about shadow work a lot and other things, but I feel like that's what we're going to be mainly getting into. Thank you for coming along and having a chat with me, babe.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited.
Excited. I've watched your channel for ages. You're one of the first witches I lurked, actually. And yeah, your relationship with the Morrigan gave me the impetus to be like, I want goddess worship in my life. I don't even care if I used to find it strange or unrelatable. Now I'm going to do it. So you have strongly influenced me in that way, but you also strongly influenced me to talk more about my own journey in relation to my interest in shadow work, because you're very honest about the things you've been through and you've talked about it at length. I feel like you've really given a lot to the community on this subject. So yeah, you're someone who's regularly talked about it. Can you like talk a little bit about how it's benefited you to talk about it on your channel and to be so open about it with people?
Yeah, sure. So, in the beginning, it was more sort of verbalizing and documenting many of my experiences so I wasn't just carrying them inside like a weight. There was a sort of self-relief and sort of journaling that almost came in the very beginning of talking about difficult experiences and the shadows that arose from them. It was kind of cathartic, to be honest with you. And as the more I talked about it, the more I realized that it was very connective. There were many other people who were experiencing similar things. Perhaps they hadn't been through the exact situations and traumas that I had, but they had been through their own, and to talk about it was very connective. And you realized that you are not alone in these experiences, which was massively empowering for me, and it made me feel 100% better in a time where I did feel very isolated. Because if you talk about a lot of these things in person to people, people are very uncomfortable about it. But there's a sort of safety within a video screen, and I'm obviously talking either to a camera or to somebody over a camera, and there is a little bit of a buffer area, which means people allow themselves the time to sit down and think about what it is that you're saying, and that it is okay that they've experienced it too. So for me, it was massively connective. It brought back a sense of hope and a sense of community in the end. It really did sort of grow into a sense of, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you've been, we've all been through something, and there are definitely areas that connect us all. There are emotions that connect us all that perhaps we're not comfortable talking about in everyday life. So for me, it was massively connective in that perspective, and it helped me to release a lot of things that I was carrying, so they didn't become overwhelming.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And also, I suppose when you talk about these things on video and on your channel and everything like that, it's very rare that you're going to get people who are made uncomfortable by it or who feel it's a taboo, because it's totally their choice to watch it. You're not asking anybody to watch it. You're not forcing anybody to watch it. They choose their level of involvement. And if what they want to do is get deeply involved and hear from someone who is not afraid of talking about these things, then they'll connect with your stuff. And I suppose probably like me, you've received, I'm sure, messages from people saying thank you, because now I feel like I can own my story, and that's very powerful as well.
I have one that whenever I'm feeling in doubt of what I'm doing, I go back to that moment when somebody messaged me and they told me they were on the verge of ending their life, and they found this video and they stopped themselves. And I sat with that message for days, because part of me didn't know what to even do with that, because it was, because of this video, I'm still alive, is the exact words they said to me. And that affected me so deeply. It it nearly makes me cry even now remembering it, because what more can you say than that? Somebody felt completely and utterly alone in that moment, and they found a video on the internet that you put out there, And in that moment, they realized they were not the only person that felt this way and had been through all of these difficult things. And they felt able to reach out and continue their journey because of it. And there's nothing more impactful, there's nothing more meaningful to me than moments like that. And I've had other beautiful messages over the years, but that one, for obvious reasons, it stays right like here. So yeah, it definitely does have an impact, and some good, some bad, but it definitely has an impact, and makes it all worthwhile, really.
Yeah, oh my God, that's so profound. Are those kinds of messages, like you said, when you're in doubt, because you do get into those periods of doubt where you're like, what am I doing here? Exposing so much and whatnot, and talking about stuff that's so sometimes dark, that helps you, recognize you should carry on. And I suppose that takes me on to the next question, which is, what are the shittier bits of being stuff and talking about shadow work in such a public way?
Well, I feel like that's a twofold question, because sometimes there are unpleasant parts that come from outside of you, and there are unpleasant parts for the self. So from outside of you, I have had some interesting accusations because I talk about shadow work, which have ranged from, I don't understand why you would bring that in the public realm, that's private, that kind of snooty kind of snideness, which you can just kind of be like, well, because it matters. Right up to being accused of being a professional victim and encouraging other people to be a victim by talking about shadow work. And that took me a moment, because I was like, you begin to question yourself, like, am I living in a victim mindset by discussing these things? And that is definitely not the intention you set out with. The intention on continuously talking about shadow work is that you're reaching different people, you're covering different ground, you're going deeper, you're understanding yourself, and you're basically dragging all this up into the light to unpack it, to deal with it, to understand yourself better, and heal and connect. So when somebody comes in and like, well, you're a professional victim, you like to make money off being a victim, you're encouraging other people to be victims, and you don't know what to do with that in the beginning, because you're like, wow, okay. Until you get to the point where you're comfortable enough with who you are, because this starts in the process of shadow work, obviously, that feeds into that self-doubt shadow, that somebody's basically dumped a massive shadow on your head, and you're like, okay, I can't see now, what do I do with this? And you have to basically start working through that until you get to the point of, no, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not encouraging anybody into being a victim mindset. I'm not telling anybody that they have to sit in their pain forever and never move. That's never been what I have encouraged someone to be. I've never told somebody to give up. I've never not advised people to also get help if they need, medical assistance, or if they need psychological assistance. I've always encouraged people to do that as well as the spiritual work. So ultimately, you have to get a place where you reject that. And that kind of feeds into the second one, which is, by talking about shadow work, you kind of are doing shadow work by talking about it, because you're drawing attention to it, you're pulling up memories, you're pulling up your own experiences, you're basically forcing yourself to relive publicly what you have experienced, because I consider it to come from a place of almost being like a storyteller. And not that the story is not true, but we are all sort of crafters of our own stories. We retell them in our own words from our own perspectives, and other people's perspectives will differ naturally. But we know our own motivations, our own energies, our own emotions in that moment. So we kind of are crafting these stories of shadow, and when we're talking about them to people, we're kind of reliving them, we're kind of repainting them, we're kind of dealing with all of that at the same time as expressing what it is to deal with it. So it can become very emotionally overloading if we're not careful, which is sometimes why I take breaks from it. It's sometimes why I play around with what I'm actually putting out there sometimes, because it can be exhausting, because it's very high intensity work to talk about what you've been through, examine what you've been through, seek to understand what you've been through and what it means to you, and where it has brought you and who you are in that equation, and then putting it out there for other people at the same time, for them to listen, for them to learn if that's what they came to do, or just to sit in the energy of it, it can be massively exhausting.
Yeah. And I'll often look back over my time of talking about it, because I've also been talking about it for ages and ages. And I think to myself, do I put out more shadow work content when I'm not doing shadow work myself? And I think I probably do. I think when I'm doing it, I can't also be invested in talking about it and encouraging others to do it or sharing my observations. I don't really know what my observations are yet while I'm in a period of doing it. I might refer to it a bit and say, oh, I'm going through something and this is the theme that I'm looking at, but I won't, it's highly unlikely I'm going to put out a 40-minute video on shadow work when I'm actually processing shadows myself, which is why it's probably been a while now, because when you go through your own organic times of doing it, the input isn't there for you. You have to focus fully on yourself. Otherwise, I think you're probably not going as deeply as you could be, because you can't spread yourself out in all those, you know, in both directions, can you? You sort of got to hit it where it hurts and go for what's happening in you. Do you find the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. We said before we started recording, I haven't actually made a video about this for a little while, and the reason mainly is because I've lost family members this year. So I've been dealing with shadows around family and grieving and complicated grief. And eventually I will talk about it, because I think it is important, and it may be sooner rather than later now, because I feel like I'm coming out the other side of it, and December is a difficult month for many people regarding family relationships and grief and things of that nature. And but I definitely wasn't at a place until recently where I felt ready to talk about it, because I was experiencing it, because it's very foggy in the midst of it. You're kind of trying to navigate your way through it. Sometimes shadow work is literally sitting in it and crying and not knowing what to do with it. And at that point, that's what you need, but that's not going to really express itself to other people, other than the fact that it's okay to sit in it and cry and have those moments of overload in the beginning, because that's natural. But that's not really deep diving, it's not unpacking, it's not assisting. So yeah, absolutely, that is definitely the case for me too.
That's a really heavy, you know, theme to have to address in shadow work. Obviously, like, bereavement's always really tough, but when the bereavement comes along with all of these family shadows, complicated relationships when the person was living, complicated grief, which I'm really sorry to hear that you're going through. I studied that a long time ago, and it's one of those things that it takes grief down a completely different road where you're not basically processing it properly. You know, aside from those themes and observations that obviously I'm sure are really hard, do you have other things since you stopped making videos that you're processing in shadow work, like any particular subjects that you find, oh, this is really coming through for me in shadow work and I'm having to really look at it?
I feel like there are big personal ones that come up on the cyclic nature, and then there are seasonal ones that come up on a cyclic nature. So seasonally, we're like dead set running into Christmas or Yule or however you celebrate the holidays. So that brings up family shadows, where you belong in the family unit, your worth in the family unit, and if it doesn't feel like a loving environment, then all the shadows associated with that. For me, this also kind of crisscrosses into shadows of not feeling seen, not feeling valued, and these are ongoing deep shadows of readjusting a sort of sense of self, which is constantly difficult when you have been through so much trauma to read signals from other people correctly. So there is a process of analysis with the shadow for me in particular, which is boundaries at the same time as knowing your worth. So there is a, am I worth it to people? Have people disappeared? Have people abandoned me? And likely not. It's likely this time of year, everybody is rushed off their feet, everybody's stressing about something around this time of year. But those shadows creep in, again, because of the time of year. So for me, there's definitely that. Is it worth what I'm doing? Is it of value? And then you have to kind of look at, well, why are you putting all that value outside of the self, and where is that coming from? Because if you know deep down what you do is worth it to you, then it definitely will be worth it to someone else, because we are not as alone as we suppose. And this year has definitely been a massive lesson. This year and the end of last year has been a massive lesson in community and not being as alone as you believe, and sort of when you sort of staring the worst times in your life where you feel like you could lose everything, you could lose your home, you could be in a terrible situation, and finding like the whole community just comes out in support and to help was massively like shadow breaking in a way for me, because I remember those moments of when I feel alone and that shadow is creeping in for whatever reason it might be creeping in, that this year has been one massive lesson in connectedness, in community, in it doesn't have to look like you think it should look like in order for it to be of value and to connect with people. You just do it the way that you do it rather than thinking that it should look like something else. So for me, those have been the massive shadow lessons of this year.
I love how you called it shadow breaking. Like, I had a shadow, I worked through it a bunch of times, it came back on a loop, and then something happened to just crack it. And I was like, oh, there we go, that's not a shadow anymore. And I've fully felt that way about things where I'm like, I will never have to work through this again. It's done. And if you don't get that feeling after working on a cyclical shadow or a theme that keeps coming up, it's okay. I don't try and push it or force it, but I have those moments where I'm like, oh, it's cracked. It's like the stone table in Narnia. It's just gone now. I love it. It feels so good. And I also have a lot of shadows around community, friendship, trust, betrayal, yeah, that kind of thing. And it's because of past experiences and whatnot. And so I understand how that comes by on a loop, because you're in relationships, friendships, whatever, your whole life long. And sometimes something will remind you of something from the past and you'll instantly go, oh, it's the same thing. You're going to screw me over. It's the same thing. You don't value me. You're eventually going to show me your true colors. And I can be sometimes quite quick to instantly put something in the betrayal box or in the this isn't a real thing box. And then I'm like, wow, that's still very powerful. That's still very strong. And then you have to go back into it and rework the old stuff, which kind of brings me to something I definitely wanted to make sure I talk to you about, because I think a lot of people experience this, is that when you're looking at past experiences where you feel like you made a mistake, you feel like you didn't see something you should have seen, you feel like, you know, you should have taken a different path, it's very easy to say, I need to shadow work that. That's an experience that's still affecting me. I'm still getting triggered by that experience. But then you get stuck on feeling very angry with yourself or very ashamed with yourself, and you cannot stop beating yourself up. And every time you go over the memory, all you can think of is, why couldn't I see it? Why did I do that? Why didn't I do this? And a lot of people find that they get stuck there, and then eventually they sort of abandon ship, because they're like, you know what, this isn't actually shadow work anymore. I'm not doing anything of merit, of substance. I'm just beating myself up every time, which is supposed to be the opposite of what shadow work is about. Of course, you have to go through a process. And I always say anger towards yourself and others is part of that process. Shame can be part of that process. But what do you think people should do when they drop anchor there and they literally just cannot stop beating themselves up or feeling ashamed?
So what I've advised people for in the past, and usually is around very serious situations in that circumstance, when you tend to get very stuck in that situation, it's something that's hurt you very badly. And so I usually say to people, well, the first step is really sitting with yourself and then forgiving yourself for how you chose to survive, for the mistakes you made, because you cannot do anything about who you were then. And trying to control who you were in the past is a fruitless exercise that will keep you going around in loops. You have all the control to choose who you become and make different decisions going forward and learn from that, but you cannot change what was done. You can just look at it, learn from it, and advance past that point. I think a lot of people don't actually consider forgiveness as a massive part of shadow work, and I think it really is, because we're all human and we get into these spiritual kind of loops of, well, I am a witch, so I should have been more intuitive than this, or I've done all this work in spirituality, so I should have identified this behavior in someone else. And I think we forget that we're human first. We fall in love with the wrong people. We make the wrong friends sometimes. We ourselves behave badly, grouchy, tired, angry, triggered by something. We're human beings first. And forgiveness is a massive part of shadow work for me. And what was really interesting to me is finding out that a lot of abuse survivors say the exact same line, which is well, other people have had it worse than me. And people who have been locked in basements for 10 years have said this exact same line. It's really common to people who survived some of the worst situations. And I think that's human nature, is to one, try and make lighter of a situation so it's easier to handle, but also not feel that they're entitled to the more difficult emotions surrounding a situation. Like, they're not entitled to be angry, they're not entitled to be guilty or feel shame. And like you already said, you absolutely are entitled to all of those emotional responses. You don't have to stay there, but you're entitled to feel them and kind of consider yourself moving through that emotion and embodying that emotion for a while, allowing yourself to sit in it, and then allowing it to grow from that point. But I think if people just forgave themselves for the situations they've been through and how they chose to be in that moment, it doesn't have to define who you are forever. So I think that would probably be my number one piece of advice for people who are very stuck on a particular experience. It's, well, okay, it happened, but who are you now? How are you changing? How are you interacting with this same situation now? What did you learn? That's more important going forward than making a mistake in the past, I think.
Yeah, I think that forgiveness of self is so important, and that probably is one of the early things needs to be focused on first if one is still beating themselves up. I think I think a lot of people listening to this will be like, okay, that makes sense, but at the same time, forgiveness can be such a sticky word when it comes to other people, the people who wronged you. And it's sticky for me and sticky for a lot of people, because forgiveness is very forgiveness is one of those words, isn't it? It's got a lot of baggage associated with it. Like
Oh, yeah.
there's like religious baggage associated with it. There's this idea that forgiveness needs to result in reconciliation. So there's a lot of manipulation in forgiveness, like, oh, forgive your family member, forgive your partner, but that doesn't need to be the same as allowing them to carry on with their BS and carry on mistreating you. And for a lot of people, they've got that mixed up. And so I always, whenever I'm talking about forgiveness towards self, I feel like that's a straightforward thing where people get that. But whenever I'm talking about forgiveness towards others, I tend to try and say forgiveness or release, depending on what you feel. For some people, forgiveness of the person who mistreated them is absolutely out of the question and feels very unhealthy. And for others, it's like, I could not have gotten to the end of my shadow work without forgiving. But it depends, doesn't it, on what forgiveness means to you as a person.
Yeah, absolutely. So I understand this really, really well because as a survivor of sexual abuse, forgiveness is not something that I can necessarily give in the way that a lot of people bring forward. So when you talk about these things in terms of shadow work, a lot of people are like, you have to forgive or you'll never move on. You have to forgive or you'll be poisoned by it. And they don't fully understand that the idea of forgiveness is usually used against somebody who's been in that situation for a very long time as a methodology of control manipulation, like you said. So for me, it's definitely more of a release. It has definitely been I don't harbor all that anger and rage anymore because that doesn't do me any good. That doesn't allow them a measure of forgiveness for me because I don't grant it to the individual who did it to me, because that would basically feed them in a way that I'm unwilling to. And I know it would, because I'm, more intimately familiar with the situation than anybody else can be. So it absolutely is a very loaded word. I often share things and talk about the fact that the idea of this kind of spiritual bypassing forgiveness thing that gets, bandied around is not the be all answer for everybody. It can be a very powerful experience for some people, and if that helps release you from a situation and move past anger and hurt and things and helps you on the road to recovery and healing, then great. But it's not a be all answer, and I don't think shadow work is a be all answer. There is no one methodology, there is no one type fits all for everybody. It's very personal and individual when it comes to moving through shadow work.
Oh. Yeah. And I've always had a bit of not a bee in my bonnet, but sometimes I've heard over the years people say, there's a lot of stuff out there on shadow work. There actually isn't. I mean, but like, in the little community that we're in, a lot of people do talk about it. And People have said things like, but there's no one methodology, there's no one sort of system, there's no one, and that's what I'm going to show you, or that's what we should have, or that's what, and I just think to myself, that's absolutely not possible. And if we were to say it was possible, shadow work would fail like 98% of the people that try it, because it's individual to your personality, your circumstances, how deep you're able to go in that moment, you know, whether or not you need to talk to other people along the way or not, like whether you want to use more spiritual stuff for it, creative stuff for it. It's so dependent on the individual, that the idea of having a one size fits all answer to what it can mean and how you should go through it is, I think it's actually preposterous. And every time I've heard that, I'm like, well, that's not going to happen. And if you're shilling that, stop. Because it can't be possible. And where forgiveness is concerned, you know, I often think about the Marianne Williamson quote, taking the hook out of you takes the hook out of me. And that's all I think of forgiveness as being. I think the word is very complicated. It's a little bit like yesterday I was thinking about how in the collective shadow, when we talk about the word privilege, it's very sticky for people to get through. I understand what we mean when we talk about privilege, and I'm okay with it. I know that nobody's trying to say I've had a perfect life just because they want me to think about my white privilege or my able-bodied privilege or whatever. But I understand why people get stuck on it, because within the English language, it's often meant you've had a fucking good time, you've had no problems, nothing's gone wrong for you, you're privileged. Especially in this country, I don't know how they're using it elsewhere where they speak English, but in this country it means you've had a very comfortable, cushy situation. And for a lot of people who are being asked to accept their privilege and look at their privilege, that has absolutely not been the case for them. And so they can't get past it. And I often think to myself, you know what, I really wish we'd picked a different word. Because privilege is just such a sticky word for a lot of people to get over and to understand, like, oh, I see what you mean. You're not accusing me of having no issues. You're not accusing me of never having a hard life. You're saying I have privileges by default of my experiences that I can't control, my situation from birth. And you're not trying to judge where I've been in my life. And forgiveness is a similar thing, where I can say to myself, okay, well, forgiveness to me means I'm not carrying this anger around anymore. I'm swallowing the poison and expecting you to die. And so I forgive you for me. I need to forgive you for me. But for other people, it doesn't mean the same thing. It means I let you off from what you've done. I tell you by forgiving you that it's okay. It's okay that you abused me. It's actually not a bad thing that you abused me. And I can never ask someone to do that. So the word is very loaded, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that is the thing. Maybe seeing as how we tailor shadow work to the individual, maybe the individual needs their own set of words or definitions around what the process is for them. Maybe that's part of the shadow work in and of itself, to discover where the word of liberation for them lies, whether that's forgiveness, whether that's release, whether there's an entirely different word, wherever it is that they feel of a point of where they feel a bit like they can breathe again and they feel a bit lighter, that moment of freeing themselves from like the parts of shadow that work that are chaining them down a bit and keeping them constricted. So maybe that is part and parcel of the wording is so personal that maybe that needs to be a discovery for everybody.
Totally. Yeah, and we weren't really left with much hard and fast actual structure and technique anyway. It's more the concept, I think, that other people have built on over time and have contributed greatly to that building on of the concept, which I love. But essentially, yeah, I feel a similar way, that what works for some people won't work for others. I've had people say under my shadow work videos, oh my God, this is just absolutely paradigm shifting. And other people are like, what the fuck? I've got nothing. You rambled on for 50 minutes and I literally feel no more enlightened. I'm like, well, you know, I mean, and there's one video where I suggest so many things you can do for your shadow work, all these different things you can do. And I suggest all these different techniques, but I do stress, like, you know, there's no cookie cutter, one size fits all. Some people will never want to do a ritual in relation to shadow work, and some people will think it's absolutely necessary. I think it's necessary. Nothing is completed without it. So, but it's up to you. I'm not going to tell somebody you absolutely have to do it this way, or there's no way it's going to help you. But in the comments, there's always the occasional person that's like, I was looking for a system, I was looking for the way to do it, and I was like, oh pickle, you definitely brought to the wrong house.
Yeah, I think that's a thing. And it's not just shadow work. I feel like that comes to a lot of spirituality, that people just, they're in that moment of feeling lost for whatever reason, and they want a step-by-step plan to not feeling lost anymore. And actually, they don't realize how powerful the moment of feeling completely lost is, because in that moment, you start to realize that the only person who can truly shape your path is you. And you can take advice, you can listen to people, you can see what intuitively beats with you, and what really gives you that moment of awakening, that aha moment that really resonates. I really want to incorporate that. I want to try that. I feel excited for it. But I feel like so many people come looking for the cookie cutter answer way of doing things, and it's right down to, I want the recipe for this. I want the step-by-step guide for this. And for the longest time, I've been saying, there isn't one. And not everybody wants to hear that. But I don't know that they realize in that moment how powerful that moment of not knowing is, because that's just unlimited potential and possibility from that point. You get to shape who you're becoming and how you get there. And I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed, and it would be really nice if you could get across that message of, yeah, but all this potential and all this excitement, and it might not feel like that in that moment. It might feel overwhelming, but at the same time, you get to shape yourself from that point. So
I just feel like I had a paradigm shift as I'm talking. Well, I feel like I need to go to pay for you for this afterwards. I think I need to put some money in your PayPal. But that's the moment of being lost, being the moment of illumination, is like, yeah, it's similar to something I always say about like the kitchen floor moment, that you have to break down to break through. And actually, the moments where I've been in the fetal position, in the dark, on the kitchen floor, wailing, have been so awful. But so after, like immediately afterwards, I'm like, Jesus Christ, I've just been born. That's just wild. And everything does feel very like I can everything's an option now. I've broken, so the only thing to do is remake myself. And yeah, I think you're right. I think it's if you possibly can, and I'll think about this a lot more now if I ever do any shadow work content in the future. I will always think to myself, how can I communicate the potential and excitement of that moment of feeling like, oh, what's happening next? I don't know what's going on anymore. Because there is excitement and huge potential in it. That's true.
There's also that survivability too, because that moment of feeling broken is the worst, but following it, you know that you've survived that. You know that you got through that really terrible moment. So I feel like it's important to just emphasize to people as well. Sometimes you need to congratulate yourself what you have survived. Yes, you need to turn that into a thriving energy. Yes, you need to move past that, but maybe just celebrate the fact that you did it. You got through that. And I feel like people look at pain and they don't consider that either. Sometimes they don't consider that moment of, you know what, I'm a badass motherfucker, I got through that. And I think those moments are really empowering too.
Yeah, and I think that's where people have got you twisted when they've said you're a professional victim. Because I think a lot of people have not given themselves any opportunity to say, do you know what, I survived that. That was really hard and I actually got through it. And I think that people say to themselves, I can't do that. I can't say that. Who am I to say that? And so to see somebody standing in their power and saying, I survived. And not only that, I encourage you to see how you survive too. For someone who can't go there, they will become very defensive and be like, oh, look at you. Like, you just want to focus on your victimhood. And the same thing happened with the Me Too movement, which was a huge act of collective shadow work, where people that were against it, I noticed, very often said how weak these people are, that's what they focus on. And that's, they're focusing on the terrible thing that happened to them rather than on surviving it. And I was like, speaking it into reality and not cowering anymore is absolutely surviving it. Is absolutely the opposite of perpetual victimhood. It's people have just got it so twisted, and it's because they're scared of going there, and so they want to shame anybody who goes there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Me Too movement was really interesting in terms of the strange reactions it brought out in people. I think for a lot of people, it was, again, a massive moment of liberation. It was a massive collective movement which allowed people to feel connected and not alone in their experiences, and realize how widespread it was. And for other people, they were threatened by perhaps this massive shadow rising moment of saying, this is a collective problem in society. This is happening to way too many people. And the facts and figures about young women who have, been through some kind of sexual abuse or domestic abuse, it's massive, it's frightening, it is very depressing to think about, just how many. But it's also, again, a connective experience that you are not alone. It is not okay, and we will stand up together until something is done. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's also the fact that, you know, in, like you said, the statistics on this are ridiculous. The stories, by the time I was 20, I don't think I'd spoken to a single woman my own age who hadn't been through something like this at least once. And what really sort of chills me about the Me Too movement and some of the dialogue around it that was really toxic was that people couldn't see their way to understanding that women are doubted perpetually on this because women themselves are seen as manipulative, underhanded liars. That has been socially normalized. And even I was getting to the point where I was like, well, hang on a minute, we can't just have trial by media. We have to acknowledge that some of these stories are going to be blatantly untrue, even if it's a small percentage. But then I read on social media one day something that opened my eyes to my own internal bias and my own internalized misogyny. And it was this person saying, if somebody runs into a cafe and says, my car's just been stolen, nobody says to them, well, hang on a minute, has your car really been fucking stolen? Or is like, where is it? Is it round the corner? If somebody's house was broken into, if somebody was punched in the face, if any of those things happen, our first thought is not skepticism. Our first thought is not, were you asking for it? There's something specific about this in society that shows how women actually are viewed as a collective. And I was just like, wow, and I'm swallowing that poison as well. I have been swallowing that poison as well, and I have not been exempt from it. I need to shadow work that. So much good came out of it. But also, yeah, I saw so much toxicity. I was like, wow, that is toxic the way you're thinking. Thanks for letting that come to the light, because I know not to be in your aura anymore.
yeah. There was actually, I can't remember the numbers, but there was something about it when the Me Too movement came out with how many people were actually focusing on the idea of false accusation versus the percentage of times that actually happens. And the percentage of time it actually happens is next to nothing. And the focus on it was massive. And there was so much talk around, well, don't you feel that, people who falsely accuse should get jail time? And I don't think many people who have actually been abused would be against that idea, because that's making their honest claim and their honest truth less believed, because, a very, very small figure of people are falsely accusing. And so people who have been through these traumatic events aren't going to support people who are lying about it. It makes no sense. There's this weird dissonance between the two, and it's just purely to try and undermine people, as
Yeah.
if the massive amount of people who've been through something like this are lying on some level. And it's the figures and the experiences, and everyone I've ever spoken to who's been through something, it takes a massive amount of courage to talk about it. For a lot of people, they've been manipulated, they've been controlled, they've been shamed, they don't want to talk about it, and some people never will. And that, again, that's another reason it's really important for other people to talk about the more difficult elements of shadow work in the public sphere, because at least they can hear that they're not alone, even if they can't speak it into being.
Definitely. And it's also people's unwillingness to believe that their father, their brother, their friend, their colleague would have done something like this that makes it so hard for a woman to come out and say it, because they don't know who they're going to lose in the process of shattering or risking shattering somebody else's perfect view of someone. And before I move on from this, I just want to clarify, because I feel like people will listen to this and think, okay, so is Kellyanne saying no one should go to trial and we shouldn't look at any evidence? But the tweet that I read clarified, like, first of all, we don't question people like this so much on other kinds of crime. Our first instinct with other kinds of crime is not skepticism and like side-eyeing the person. That's not how it is. And the person said, if later something went to we examining the evidence and it turned out this person's car was not stolen, this person was not punched in the face, this did not happen to this person, then fine, fair enough. But we usually wait for for evidence to come to light. We normally accept that somebody's telling the truth until they're proven otherwise, whereas it's completely the other way around with women and sexual assault. And it's because people are uncomfortable, and it's because people don't want to deal with it, and it's because they don't want to have their image shattered of somebody. And at the same time, the portrayal of women as being deceptive or underhanded is normalized. So I'm not in any way saying, hey, let's believe everybody all the time, 100% of the time. I'm saying, look at the degree of skepticism that you're putting towards something where, like, yeah, as you said, I read it's like 7% or something that's been proven of, of reported cases are actually false. So I just feel like, yeah, it's a massive, the amount of skepticism versus actually the amount of false accusations is ridiculous. And that's something to do with how women are viewed. And hopefully a lot more people have come to that conclusion now as a result of being forced to do shadow work, because collective shadow work is it really sort of bends your arm, doesn't it? It's like, okay, I need to look at it. It's absolutely everywhere. It's all that anyone's talking about. And actually, I have some problems in this area I need to look at. So I encourage collective shadow work so much. I wish there was more of it, actually.
It's massively important. I know that it affected me in a lot of different ways because it actually intersected with personal shadow work. So just to continue with the idea of how women are viewed, it's a really easy example for me. Like growing up, there was elements of people who were like, oh well, she's dressed like this, and that's, she's sexually provocative, she's asking for it. There was like people around me who were encouraging that methodology of thinking, and then that's a collective shadow as well. So they cross over. This idea of how a woman dresses makes any difference, and it's like, no, the crimes have been around for generations, and what women has been wearing has been anything from Victorian dresses right down to their ankles, and they were still carrying on, and buttoned up to the neck. So that it's not about the dress, it's not about the length, it's about the attitude towards women and treating women as objects. So there's definitely like that crossover between the shadows that we grow up with or we've absorbed on a personal level somewhere, and then like the collective shadow, which confirms what we're hearing, because that's then what everybody else is saying about it en masse, and it can be really difficult to suddenly realize, that's a thing for me. And it does pop up in places, and as much as I want to encourage women, and as much as I try and empower women and reach out to women, I still find that sometimes you catch yourself with one of those collective shadows, like, oh that's something for me to work on. That's definitely about me and not about other people.
Yeah, and that goes back to not shaming yourself or beating yourself up. For me, I just always go, oh, look what I've ingested. But of course I've ingested it. It's airborne. I'm gonna take some of it in as a woman. And whereas when I first started reading about feminism, and I was late to that game, believe me, I would be like, oh my God, I'm a bitch. I'm a wrong un. But actually now I'm like, well, of course we ingest these things. They're all around us all the time.
Yeah.
I know a lot of your work with the shadow has been sort of focused on dealing with the aftermath of abuse, and so I was kind of wondering what your thoughts are on having experienced abuse, the feeling of why did this happen to me? Why me? Why was I targeted? Why wasn't I enough? Why wasn't I loved? I know people go through all those things. And of course, there's a process in shadow work where you look at what somebody who abused you or mistreated you has gone through in their life, or what they didn't have in their upbringing. And you can kind of see your way to saying, okay, I see why there was a cycle of abuse, and I see why I was in the firing line. But it doesn't stop people, does it, from having those feelings of like, I wasn't enough, I wasn't worthy, I deserved to be treated in this way somehow, or why did this happen to me?
Well, there was a point actually where, like, my mother was just, my mother was an enabler, and at one point she said to me, oh well, he was abused in his childhood, as if that excused it. And I remember very vividly turning around and going, well, he should have known better then, because I was very angry at the assertion that just because you've been abused, then you will go on to abuse other people. Because I really hate that kind of assumption. There's sort of like almost like it takes like the personal responsibility out, because it's clearly not the case. Not all people who have been harmed. Otherwise, women en masse would be harming other people. So for me, it's a very difficult situation in that still, because when you do a lot of the empathetic work, you begin to understand why people might be acting the same way that they are. Why, and when it gets right down to abusiveness, which some of the worst kinds of things, then It's very difficult because your immediate reaction is to disassociate them from being human. You know, you want to consider them to be the monster that did this, and they are just disassociated from their humanity. And that can be where people go for healing for a while. And if that's where people need to be in order to get, again, however people need to survive the aftermath, if that gets them from feeling like they can't cope, and they use their anger and they use their resentment to get through as a catalyst, I think then that can be healthy. It's not healthy to stay there, but I think that is definitely a place that transforms you from one place to another.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's part of it as well. I don't think I can blame anybody for having those feelings, even for a very extended period. I think, you know, for me, one of the things people ask me about and have like dialogue with me about is, how do you know that something needs to be shadow worked? How do you know that that's something that you need to place your focus on? And so I wrote down a few ways that I know I need to do shadow work, especially around past experiences. And I wrote things like, I'm having dreams about it, usually crappy dreams that I wake up and I'm like, oh my God, that's really bothering me. I drop it into conversations a lot or keep referring to it in my own head. And that kind of goes back to what I said earlier about something might be happening and I might be overly relating it to what happened before, or maybe even being fearful that it's going to turn out that way, even though there really isn't that much evidence to suggest that it is. I consistently wish things had been different in some way, and I rearrange in my head what happened so that it looks better or feels better, and then beat myself up about the fact that it didn't look like that. I say, I've written, I feel like I can't focus on the future because that part of my past is taking over. I'm comparing, oh yeah, any remotely similar situation to it. Would you say all of these signs are similar for you? And do you have any other signs that you would say, like, you know, when you see that, you really ought to shadow work the thing?
Most of mine are very, very similar. I definitely get the shadow dreaming. Oh my goodness, the shadow dreaming. That can be really nightmarish, like literally, but yeah, nightmarish, because you have no recourse. You just kind of watch it and then wake up and then you're like, ugh. But I feel like one of the things that happens to me as well is sometimes I'm overwhelmed in an emotional response, and I'm not entirely certain where the emotional response is coming from to start with. So it might not immediately make sense why I feel so angry about a situation, or I feel really like crying and weeping, and I'm not entirely certain where it's come from. And it might not even be in a reaction to a similar trigger. It might just be completely out of the blue, and you're not sure where it's coming from. And then that is a sort of, right, this is a moment of something's triggering my shadow from somewhere, so I need to sit in it, feel it, and then start unpacking it. So that's the one that does happen, but the others are really similar, yeah.
I love that observation of wondering where something is coming from and not knowing, because that's, to me, now sort of looking back over the timeline of my life, I've realized I've come to know myself in such a really strong, deep way that even when I don't know why the hell something is bugging me, I know that something is wrong, and I actually want to do the work. I want to look at it and go, what is this? Why is this coming up? There's no reason for it that I can see, but it's bothering me. And it will be like the way a person's behaving, or the way somebody said something to me, or, you know, when I'm unpacking a past experience, I'll be like, I'm done with this. I am done with this. I don't see why it's coming up, but I want to inquire, and I will sit there and I will do deep meditation, and I will, you know, I'll ask my goddess for guidance. And I'm interested. I'm interested. It's something that bothers me, but there's also a curiosity to it where I say to myself, you know what, don't worry, I'm going to get to the bottom of it, because it is bothering me and it is holding me back, or it's making me fearful. And I will figure out, and I'll put my finger on it. And that moment where I'm like, oh, right, fuck. It's because they remind me of that person, or it's because I did this and that, I'm, you know, and then I'm just like, it all comes together, and I get a feeling of joy that I sat with myself through that. I didn't shut it down or berate myself. I was like, no, hang on, let me be curious about this, because there's a reason and I want to get to it. That feels really, really good.
Yeah, yeah,
Love that.
absolutely. That's again that celebration, I think, that's really important with shadow work. People I think they talk about shadow work and they think, oh no, it's going to be awful and terrible, and there's not going to be any like joy that comes out of shadow work. And I think that's really wrong. I I think because people are like, right, I'm dealing with these difficult emotions, or I'm dealing with this difficult situation, then it's just going to feel negative the whole time. And I think to express that you can celebrate your victories, you can pat yourself on the back, you can have moments of feeling good about certain things, perhaps makes shadow work slightly more accessible, and makes people slightly less reluctant to dive in.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And to me, I feel like the dialogue around shadow work amongst people who do it and believe in it and find it helpful can be heavy-handed in one way or the other. I might have been probably heavy-handed in the direction in the past, in the direction of this is tough shit. This is actually really hard. But I want to clarify that for people because it isn't a cakewalk. But then on the other hand, there's this other extreme where it's like, don't be made to fearful by, you know, fear mongering people who say it's really hard. It's joyful and it's awesome and it's great, and sometimes I think, well, that's a little too far in the other direction. Like, let's be honest, I mean, it's fucking hard. You know, it's not, the things that you're examining in shadow work are not like, you know, little things like somebody pissed me off and it ruined my day. It's like the deepest things that have made the parts of who you are twisted, that you're uncomfortable with or upset by, that you don't want to accept in yourself. It's the things that you've tried to run from for probably years, and you're digging that up and putting it on the table. That's absolutely not going to be birthday cake and balloons and unicorns and roses. So I think there just needs to be that mixture of both. And I think the people that are really passionate about shadow work are very often the people that have gotten the most from it. The reason that I've been talking about it on YouTube since 2012 is because I got so much from it. As soon as I understood the concept and started reading various Jungian analysts at first talking about it, I was like, this is something really big. And so I wanted to convey from my perspective, it's hard, but it helps. And I think other people wanted to convey, no, it's not hard, it's joyful and awesome and cool, and it will give you the keys to your life, because they want people to do it as well. But really, let's face it, it's six of one and half a dozen of the other. And if it's not hard, I always say you're probably not doing it right.
Mm. It's basically dark goddess lifestyle, isn't it? Because I think that some people, I don't know, maybe some people get very caught up with the image of how they portray what shadow work is and where they fit in that, rather than what shadow work then is to other people. And that's how I talk about dark goddess work, which is integral to my personal shadow work. That, yeah, it's going to suck. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful, but it's going to be worth it. And when you realize how much it's worth it, then you get that joy, you get that motivation, you get that sense of almost euphoria on the other end, that yeah, this was really tough, but I conquered it and I will continue to conquer it, and I didn't run from it. And I think there's a real moment of discovering of self in those moments. So it doesn't have to be easy and joyful, and I hesitate to use the whole word light. It doesn't have to be those things. There's a balance to it, and it's just real. I think shadow work is some of the most real, in-depth spiritual work that you will ever do. And there will be times, like you said, you're going to be curled up, you're going to be crying, it's going to, you know, break you down into pieces. But then you get that moment of discovery, you get that moment of rebuilding, you get the victory of overcoming whatever it is that has been holding you back for so long, and you get to make friends with yourself. You get to accept yourself on a level that you may not have realized you needed until you did that work. And
Yeah.
that's really important.
Yeah, that's so true. And it reminds me of the Carl Jung quote, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. And in a way, coming to consciousness is glorious. Like, so even within that quotation, because it sounds quite like, oh my God, that sounds really heavy. But actually, what he was really saying was, you don't get to the point of glory without pain. Like, you know, it will be painful, it will be hard. You will have to look at things that are uncomfortable, that you don't want to accept in yourself. But then you come to consciousness, what could be better? So it's almost like it's like saying no pain, no gain, but in a much more dramatic and cool way, which is so
We're being way more dramatic with it.
yeah. And when I would say to people, you know, that Jung said there's no coming to consciousness without pain, I certainly didn't mean there's no gain, there's no joy, there's no high. I wouldn't do it if there was no high, please. I insist on being high most of the time. So I feel like, yeah, it's in one direction or the other too much of the time, and it needs to be more honest. Before we end, you said that dark goddess work is really a prominent part of your work, and I relate to that a lot. Do you feel like that's one of the best sort of paradigms that you found, and can you talk a little bit about what it involves?
Yes.
Yes,
So
yes,
yes, that's it. Yeah. No. So dark goddess work is very intimately connected to me for shadow work. They're two. It's almost as if shadow work is almost getting a glimpse under the skirt of the dark goddess. That's kind of what it feels like. A lot of I've just put a video out about my understanding of dark goddess as she is now, which continues to evolve and grow. But dark goddess work is very much about the embodiment of areas and emotions and experiences that many people shy away from. It's difficult. They don't want to look at it. And dark goddess work is about embracing the shadow work. It's about constantly seeking to overcome and grow and understand yourself on a level of that you didn't before. And it goes back to that kind of storyteller vibe that I think for me is a big part of how I express myself. I'm a storyteller. That's how I work through a lot of what I'm going through. And we learn to sort of weave the stories of self. We give it meaning, we find new words, we find ways of expressing it. We weave together this journey of self. And the dark goddess for me, particularly through my matron Morrigan, particularly Babe, has always been a kind of guiding light, a hand on the shoulder, a call to self-betterment in a way, and how can I become more myself. It's almost like it's stripping away the layers of conditioning of who we've been told to be. And it's that the quote that really gets to me every time, which is "You were wild once, don't let them tame you." And it's kind of like, what does that mean to be my most wild, most authentic, most witchy, most female, most human, most soul in this universe experience? And dark goddess has really been a guiding, driving, largely unknowable force behind that experience for me, which has given me meaning at every sort of step. Whether I'm in the fetal position screaming at her, why this, why now, or whether I'm feeling on top of the world, realizing why that had to happen eventually. and feeling more empowered and enriched for it. So yeah, absolutely.
I love that. I'm going to watch the shit out of that video later. Stand. I'm so excited. I love talking to you about this. It's kind of got my head back in the game, focusing on things I might want to say about stuff I've been experiencing, because as I said, it's been a while since I touched this subject as well, so it's been nice to refresh on it with you. So down below I'm going to leave the links to all your social media. I'm going to also leave the link to your online store. You make amazing things, really awesome witchy things. So many people are like, oh, I've just ordered off Starry. I was surprised. I'm like, yes, of course you did. But can I ask, will you talk to people? Is that part of what you can get in the store? Do you do sessions or anything like that as well? Because I'm wondering if a few people might want that now. After what
I hope so. You can absolutely get sessions through the store, or you can get sessions through Patreon. So I have a Patreon, and at the certain level and above, you get a monthly session, and we can talk about whatever you want to. Really, I basically tailor those ones around individuals. So if they want to talk about shadow work, we can do that. If they want to just sling some cards and talk about the general energies around for the month, they can do that too. So I absolutely do conversations. I am accessible, yes.
Great. That's a really good idea for a tier on Patreon as well, I must say. That's awesome. Well, I'll put all of that in the down bar then. And thank you so much for coming on and having a deep chat with me. I very much appreciate it, babe.
Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy talking to you.